Greetings, my name is Kerry and welcome back to my channel. So as you probably know, I decided to take the month of December off from filming, give myself a little bit of a break, which I really needed at the time, so it was a good thing for me to do, but it did mean that I never filmed a November reading wrap up, and I like continuity, so I am rectifying that now. I did consider doing a combined November and December wrap up, but I read a quarter of all the books I read last year in those 2 months, so in the interest of not making that video really long, I decided to stick with doing 2 separate ones. So you will see the November one today, and then the December one I'm also filming soon, so that will be out in the next couple of days. So hopefully you don't mind that too much. It's just because I know how long my wrap-ups tend to get, I thought it was probably better to keep them to slightly more manageable sizes, because I read quite a lot of books, particularly in December. So in November I read 9 books. 2 of them were books from my own TBR, 4 of them were new books that I bought or received that year, actually I should say, because one of them was a gift, and 3 of them were books that I'd borrowed. 2 of the books were non-fiction and 1 was an anthology. And in terms of the challenges, 1 was a book from my book Death Row, 5 were independently published, 2 were from the oldest on my TBR list, and 1 completed a series for me. In terms of rating, I gave 1 book 3 stars, 7 books 4 stars, and 1 book 5 stars. So, I mean, all in all, a fairly good reading month, really. So I'm going to go through the books now from lowest rated through to highest rated. I don't have all of these books anymore. Some of them are library books, some of them I have already unhauled, but we'll just make a start, shall we? So the book that I gave 3 stars to was Remembrance by Theresa Breslin. I don't have this anymore, I've actually unhauled it already. This was from my book Death Row list. It was alright. It was quite an interesting take on the First World War and the events that happened. So it was told from the perspective of 5 young people whose lives were affected by the First World War. So 2 of them were young women who became nurses, and the other 3 were their brothers. So it was about these 2 families. One of the brothers was an officer, 1 was a regular soldier, and 1 was too young to actually be a soldier. The story looked at how all of them were affected by the events of the war. I wasn't quite sure what audience it was pitched at, so it was a winner, or the author's a winner of the Carnegie Medal, which is books for children, but it was definitely older than like books for children, but it didn't read like a YA, so it was somewhere in that strange area between middle grade and YA, it felt like to me anyway. But it was like for young teenagers is what it felt like to me, and so it felt like it dealt with some of the situations a bit simplistically to try and make them come across in the right way to that audience, at least in my opinion. But yeah, it wasn't unenjoyable. I did quite enjoy reading it, but it's not one that I would read again, so yeah, so that's why I decided to unhaul it and gave it 3 stars. For the right audience, for someone that doesn't know a lot about that time period, it would probably be a really beneficial book to read. So the first book that I gave 4 stars to was The Wind That Lays Waste by Selva Almada. This was our Ninja Book Club pick for, I want to say, for October. I got slightly behind on the Ninja Book Club books. This was really good. The author is Argentinian, but it didn't count towards my read around the world because I had already read a book by someone from Argentina, which was a little bit annoying, but never mind. It was really beautifully written. It's about a preacher and his daughter who travel around. They're on their way to visit some of their friends, but he's a travelling preacher and their car breaks down and has to be fixed by a mechanic. The mechanic has an assistant called Tapioca who isn't entirely happy with his life. The preacher's daughter also isn't entirely happy with her life. There's a storm on the way, and it's about how these 4 characters interact. The mechanic himself is very opposed to the preacher and his religion, and there's a lack of clarity about the relationship between the mechanic and his assistant Tapioca. It really is about these 4 people that are brought together in an unexpected circumstance and how they relate to each other, and I thought it was really cleverly written, really beautifully written as well. Quite a short book and not a very difficult read, but really beautifully written nonetheless. Okay, so the next book that I gave 4 stars to was called All Things Anglican by Marcus Throup. This was given to me by a friend in the summer to help me get my head around a bit more the structure of the Anglican Church and how all that works. It's non-fiction, obviously, and it's written in quite a It's quite an accessible style. It's not really academic, doesn't use really complicated language, presents everything in a quite straightforward way, and was really helpful for me for understanding sort of the structures and traditions a bit better of the Anglican Church, and how it's such a broad span of different types of beliefs, and with like a lot of things, a lot of central beliefs in common, but the outworking of that in individual churches can be very different, even from churches very close geographically to each other. There's lots of differences of style and of tradition, and even in some cases of actual belief of how the outworking of those beliefs are handled. So I found it really, really helpful actually. I've been in an Anglican church for about 5 years now, so this was really helpful for me to get my head a little bit more around it, and I made some really detailed notes as well for referring back to, so I was really grateful to have been given that copy, and I'm going to lend it to a friend now as well because I think it will help her too. The next book that I gave 4 stars to was another non-fiction one, and this is The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. So I was given this for my birthday a long time ago. This is actually one of the oldest books on my TBR, so it was good to get through this one finally. This is quite an old text, so this is thought to have been written at the beginning of the 15th century, so around 1418. And while it's not definitely sure that, or it's attributed to Thomas à Kempis rather than definitely having been written by him, he might have been involved in translating it or anything or something. I'm not entirely sure of the history of the actual text, but it was actually really encouraging. It's parts of it are written as like a conversation between Christ and the disciple, and there was lots in there that is still really beneficial to Christians today. Some of it was a bit hard to follow in places, but overall I found that a really helpful thing to read as well. It took me a few months to get through it, as I say, because in places the language was a little bit complex, or a little bit archaic, I suppose is more the word, but yeah, it was another one that I really enjoyed. And those last 2 actually were both independently published as well. And the next book that I gave 4 stars to was An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This one I borrowed from the library, really enjoyed it. I didn't realise until I got to the end that it's actually going to be the first in the series, and I think the second one comes out this year, so really keen to carry on that series as well. It was very different from what I was expecting. I don't really know what I was expecting, but I suppose I'd been assuming it would be a bit like John Green's books, but it was not really. It was much more science fiction, but sort of real world science fiction, so it's set in a very similar world to ours, if not, well, it's kind of set in our own world I guess, but with science fiction influences, alien influences coming in. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and definitely a series that I want to carry on with when there are more books to read. Found all the characters really intriguing and really human as well, and I think that was one thing that I really liked, because the main character, the narrator, April May, could have been really annoying if she hadn't been so normal and flawed. That was part of what I really enjoyed about it, was like the recognition that she knew she was not a great person, and that made her actually quite likeable, whereas if she had been unaware of her own flaws she would have been a very irritating character. So credit to Hank Green, I really enjoyed that book and really keen to carry on with that series. The next book that I gave 4 stars to was Brightly Burning by Alexa Donne. This one I picked up for the second round of Voltathon hosted by Margaret from The Word Nerd. I'll link her channel. I think there are more rounds of Voltathon coming later in the year. So Voltathon, if you don't know, is all the prompts are based on an underrated Disney movie. So this round was based on Treasure Planet, and Treasure Planet obviously being a retelling of Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. This was a great book for that because it's a retelling of Jane Eyre but set in space, and I thought it was really cleverly written. It stayed faithful to the original story in a lot of ways but also updated it, and I really liked the way the story was reframed and set in space, and sort of the politics of that society were really cleverly put together. There's a fleet of spaceships that are in orbit around Earth because Earth is no longer habitable, or it's thought to be no longer habitable. A lot of the ships are based on the countries where the people originally lived, and I just thought the whole society was really well imagined to match the class system of Jane Eyre, but to transport that into a modern setting. So some of the ships are privately owned and trying to survive, and so the people with wealth are trying to sort of stay together and keep their ships afloat, and there's a lot about how do they maintain the populations, and anyway the whole political situation, the way it was put together. It was really clever. Some similarities in some ways to the 100 series by Cass Morgan, but worked out in a slightly different way. So I thought it was really cleverly done, and I enjoyed the twist, the way that the twist in Jane Eyre was transplanted into this modern setting was I thought really cleverly done. So I quite enjoyed this. We'll be looking out for more books by Alexa Donne. I think she is doing more science fiction retellings of classic novels. That's what I've understood anyway, so I'm looking forward to seeing how they go, and really grateful to Margaret for suggesting that I read this. Obviously she didn't suggest it personally, but for including this in the readathon. The next book I gave 4 stars to was Redshirts by John Scalzi. This one I borrowed from my dad. I actually had given it to him for his birthday and he really loved it and thought I would enjoy it too, and I really did. It was very, very clever. Redshirts is based loosely upon the concept of Star Trek. If you're familiar with the original series of Star Trek, the unnamed characters in red shirts are often killed off quite early on whenever the crew go on an away mission. This was a really fun book because it explored a lot of the tropes of science fiction television particularly, and a lot of the things that we sort of take for granted about how the plots of that are put together, and really turned it on its head and made it into quite a fun storyline of these characters and trying to figure out how to keep themselves alive in this strange world that they're in. And the twist was very, very clever. And then the appendix chapters at the end, the appendices, were also really, really clever, and I just really loved the whole way that book played with the science fiction genre and its tropes, and really had a bit of a laugh at science fiction while also being a great science fiction novel. So yeah, I really enjoyed really enjoyed that book, and I'm really keen to read more John Scalzi. I actually have another book of his that I was given for Christmas a couple of years ago, so that's moved up on my TBR. I'm going to try and get to that a bit sooner. Really glad I got that for my dad for his birthday and that he enjoyed that so much as well. And then the last book I gave 4 stars to was Disturbing the Beast, which is an anthology from a small press called Boudica Press. They launched in back end of 2018. They actually set themselves up as a company and launched a Kickstarter to fund this book, and this book was released itself at the beginning of 2019. I actually supported that Kickstarter, which was how I got a copy of the book. I love this artwork on the cover, and all of the stories are quite feminist. They're about women and their rights and their worlds. Some of them with a little bit of fabulism thrown in there, some quite magical elements, some maybe more horror elements. Some of the stories I enjoyed more than others, which is all the ways the way in short story collections. My favourite one, I think, was Wrapped by Elia Whiteley. So I've read one of her novellas before, and that one was about a female archaeologist who has her discovery stolen from her by her husband and other men that make out that she's not clever enough to have discovered these things herself or translated these ancient texts herself, which is something that is still an issue in academia, that women's expertise are not always acknowledged the way they should be. So a lot of these made very important statements while as well still being good fiction. So yeah, really recommend this collection if you like short stories, or if you're looking for sort of slightly challenging feminist short stories. This is a really good collection. And then finally, I gave one book 5 stars, which was Ancillary Sword by Anne Leckie. This again I borrowed from the library. This is the second book in the Imperial Reg trilogy, which continues the storyline of the first. So in the first book, Breck, the main character, her story is told across 2 timelines from her perspective. So part of it is her remembering what has happened to her in the past, and part of it is what's happening to her now. She was formerly the AI of a large troop carrying spaceship which has been destroyed, and only one ancillary remains, which is the consciousness of the ship but in a formerly human body. And so the first book is about her trying to get her revenge for what happened to her in the past and trying to figure out how that works out. The second goes a lot more into the political situation of the Empire, and Breck is sent to a space station orbiting a planet and has to deal with the various political groups on that station. Yeah, it's just a brilliant series. Those first 2 books in that series were some of my favourite books that I read last year. I've actually just finished the 3rd one this morning, and my goodness, I'm really in awe of Anne Leckie's ability to world build, really. I know some people have found these books a bit confusing, and they are in some ways. The whole structures of the society are not very clear, and you have to really pay attention, and because the characters don't recognise gender, everyone is referred to as she, so it's sometimes hard to follow. There's also the issue of, in the first book particularly with the ancillaries, there are multiple persons that are all the same character. They're all Brack, or well, they're all Justice of Torum, which was the name of her ship. There's also the Emperor, the Lord of the Ratch, Ananda Minai, who has multiple clones who are all connected, so they're different bodies of the same person, and that can be a bit confusing, particularly as the books go on, trying to figure out which particular version of her is doing what. I mean, that's part of the storyline, is that you don't know which minion is doing which thing, but I just thought the whole series was brilliant. So yeah, so that was definitely my favourite book I read in November. One of my favourite series, a couple of my favourite books I read all year, and again, I'm grateful to a readathon. So that was the group book for third round of Tome Infinity, which took place in September, and I was Team Warfare. And that Ancillary Justice, the first book in that series, was the group book. So again, I would not have picked that book up if not for a readathon. That's just one thing that I love about readathons, is especially when they have group books that are ones that maybe hadn't been on my radar, they have become some of my favourite books. Right, so that's all the books I read in November. If you read any of those books, please let me know what you thought of them and whether you agree with my assumptions of them, so have a chat to me down in the comments about that. Please like this video if you liked it, please subscribe if you haven't already. You can also follow me on my social media. All that information is always listed in the description box below for you. And that's it for today, so thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.